It is a beautiful early fall day in Boston, and we decided to tape this introduction to my new book, The Body Keeps the Score, in my garden. It has some advantages, the nice tree in the back of me. There's some disadvantages. The sun is sort of moving around. I live close to Logan Airport, so you hear planes flying overhead, so please bear with us. But I thought I'd share a little bit of nature with you as we're talking. I've been working on this book for 10 years because I really wanted to put together a complex set of data. A lot of work that I've done. As far as I know, I'm one of the few people who is both a very serious researcher. I've done neuroimaging research, pharmacological research, endocrinological research, treatment outcome, and I'm also a very serious clinician. I've seen traumatized patients, soldiers, torture victims, child abuse, domestic abuse, accident victims for about 40 years, and I've studied them. I have studied a large variety of different treatments. There's a tendency in our field for people to identify themselves as belonging to a particular group, religion, school of thought, like I'm a psychoanalyst, or I'm an IFS therapist, I'm a EMDR therapist, I'm a neurofeedback therapist, and that I've never felt comfortable with that. I think that one size never fits all. In my own journey, I have been exposed to a very large number of different treatments myself, all of which have been helpful in different ways. And so in this book I'm really trying to lay out what different treatments are, what they consist of, who they're helpful for, what their advantages are and their disadvantages. But it's most of all based on the research work that I've done under the auspices of the National Institute of Health, the National Institute of Alternative and Complementary Medicine, the Centers for Disease Control, and a number of other private research organizations to spell out how the brain responds to trauma at various ages, the impact of trauma on thinking, experiencing yourself, on intimacy, on your relationship to your body, and really to bring the field together from multiple different perspectives. So the opening chapter, chapter 1, is about Vietnam veterans, and the last chapter is about theater and about doing Shakespeare and what Shakespeare can do to help you to overcome trauma. So it has a very big range. And I started off at a time, and I was fortunate in this regard, because when I came into the field, PTSD didn't exist, trauma wasn't talked about. My colleague down the corridor from me at one point said to me, "Bessel, when you croak, nobody will ever talk about this silly trauma stuff anymore." And I smiled, and I thought that was probably not quite going to be the case. But I started at the beginning, and I was there at the beginning when a bunch of Vietnam veterans and some psychoanalysts got together and started to lobby the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, for a diagnosis that was related to things that had happened to people, very specifically the issue of trauma. There was a great deal of resistance to that, and even today, I'll go into that a little bit, the notion that trauma can in a major way change people's minds, brains, developmental courses keeps meeting with resistance, and certainly in most schools that people go to learn about therapy, there is still not enough attention to the whole issue about the differential impact on trauma on mind, brain, and relationships through the course of treatment. Certainly the DSM is a main culprit here, which totally ignores the social context in which people grow up, They are very committed to finding a genetic / biological basis for all these silly disorders that are in the diagnostic system, while completely ignoring the fact that we are profoundly interdigitated, connected, social creatures who don't exist by ourselves. Our whole brain is geared to us being together, talking together, interacting with each other, and very few of us can tolerate being totally by ourselves without any contact with other human beings for longer than minutes, hours, days, certainly not months. And once people are able to tolerate being by themselves for that long, they are being considered mentally ill. We are social creatures. And so a very big dimension of trauma that is left out is that trauma usually occurs in the context of relationships, distorts people's relationship. So the emphasis that you hear in the news is on memory and how we can wipe out memories and make these memories less profound. But in fact, what trauma mainly does, it disturbs people's relationships to themselves, to their environment, and to their bodies. And the issue of how trauma disturbs one's relationship to one's body becomes terribly important, because in the West we are fairly disembodied people, and we'd like to think about what's happening over here, pay little attention to what it's all about. But in the context of writing my book, I looked at every single Nobel Prize that had been won in the 20th century about things having to do with mind and psychology. And every single Nobel Prize winner, starting with Pavlov in 1904 and Gerald Edelman in 1991, say something similar to what Roger Sperry says in his 1981 Nobel Prize acceptance speech. Namely, he says, the brain is the organ that makes the muscles move. It has a few other secondary functions, but the brain is about taking care of the body. It's about movement. And trauma is about the body having become immobilized, the body feeling helpless, the body feeling numbed out, and the body having a sense of an inability to fully engage, to feel alive, to feel present, and to feel present with oneself and with other people. And so I hope that my book will inspire the field to move more towards interactions, actions, sensations, etc., things that right now are still at the periphery. There's some very important people who have organized my thinking. I think maybe the most important person is my friend Alexander McFarlane in Adelaide, Australia, who is a researcher, and a very smart researcher, who has studied the brain and epidemiology and development, and who was able to show a very important issue in a study that he has not published yet. He was asked by the Australian government to do measurements of a whole variety of mental and biological functions of soldiers before they went off to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. And one of the most striking things is what he found in their EEGs, in their electroencephalograms. Now, most people don't do encephalograms on psychiatric patients, so it's a rather obscure starting point. But at some point I also got interested in internal organization of the brain, and so we went over his data. And what McFarlane shows is that with every exposure to trauma, something changes in the brain, and something changes that is very fundamental. Namely, the front of our brain is devoted to social interactions between us and other people. It helps us to communicate, to interact, to be in rhythm and in tune with people around us, and so the front part of a social, prospective, outward directed brain. The back of our brain is concerned about us. It's concerned about making sure you go to the bathroom at the right time, making sure that you breathe, making sure that you sleep, making sure that you eat and eat just the right quantity, and that your body is in chemical balance. Things that we don't pay much attention to, but things that invariably get messed up when people are traumatized. When people are traumatized, their eating becomes disturbed too much or too little, their sleeping becomes disturbed, and their whole internal rhythms become disturbed. And that is something that our field has not nearly paid enough attention to. So here is what McFarlane finds. He finds that after every deployment of these Australian soldiers, the back of the brain becomes more and more hyperactive. The rhythm in the back of the brain is supposed to be alpha waves, but it becomes more rapid. And so that means that the body is agitated. That means that people feel out of tune, out of sync, uncomfortable in their own skin. They don't feel really calm and open to the world around them because their internal stuff is bothering, their sensations. And once your sensations are bothering you, it becomes very hard to pay attention to other people. And let's say you have a stomach ache, or you're constipated, or you're terribly hungry. All these things make it very difficult to pay attention to what's going on around you. And that is very much the state of traumatized people, is that their bodies don't feel good, and basically their bodies are set to be on alert for danger, to be on alert to get hurt, and so they're always scanning the environment and never feeling calm to just let things come in. So that's the back of the brain. The front of the brain, where sort of the person you call you lives, the part of you that can speak and engage and be funny and hold forth, that part of the brain waves are supposed to be sort of low beta, fairly fast waves that make you alert and anticipate what's going on and being able to sort things out. That part of the brain becomes sleepy, along the lines of what you see in kids with attention deficit disorder. So the front of the brain is not fully there. And so the way that McFarlane puts it is that being traumatized is like living in a room with the lights turned out. And so Sandy and I have talked a lot with each other, and I think much of our thinking as human beings comes from having interactions with other people and stimulating each other's thinking. So Sandy was very important in that. Another thing that Sandy taught me is this whole notion that traumatized people have a hard time detecting what is going on. If you give them a key in their hand, or a cell phone, or an object, they have a hard time sensing what's happening. So there's a real fundamental disturbance in perceptions, and that's certainly the issue of perceptions is something that I've studied also, and the main way that I've been studying perception is by looking at the Rorschach and looking at what people make out of ink blots, basically meaningless ink blots. And what we see is that traumatized people, when they see one of these ink blots on the Rorschach, tend to either see percepts that are related to trauma, like rape victims may see a torn vagina on card number 2, or people who have been in war will see people with their head blown off, or people with gaping wounds. And so people superimpose their own perceptions on the world, or they don't see anything at all. So there is something that gets reorganized around people's perceptions, and that means that treatment needs to involve a fundamental reorganization of perception. So these issues about perception lead us to conclude that trauma leads to an impairment of imagination. And here I'd like to read you what I say about imagination. Imagination is one of our most distinctly human traits. Mental flexibility is the hallmark of imagination. traumatized people keep replaying the same old reel over and over again. Already back in 1889, Pierre Genet, famous Frenchman who first writes about trauma, says traumatized people have the evolution of their lives halted. They don't continue to grow by the addition of new elements. So for 150 years now, we have known that trauma leads to difficulty learning from experience, getting new experiences that help you to move on with your life. Traumatized people get stuck and they replay the same old thing over and over again, and sadly therapy oftentimes helps people to play that scene all over again and say, let's go back and visit your trauma. Well, visiting the trauma is an important part, but what's even more important is to be here and to be fully alive right now. And the problem with trauma is not so much what happened in the past, but because what happened in the past is over. The problem is that that the brain has changed, so it's very difficult to feel alive in the present, to feel okay right now. And much of our treatment should be focused on helping people to feel alive right now. And so there are a variety of different ways of doing that. Because people's brains are wired to play the same scenes over and over again, one of the treatments that I've been studying and that we are using in our clinic and our practices is neurofeedback. In neurofeedback, you can actually quiet down those alarm systems in the brain. You can quiet down that agitation in the back of the brain that makes your body feel out of sorts and in danger, and you can actually activate frontal lobe functioning so that people can become more attentive and focused. And that's one end of the spectrum of helping people to be present here and now. The other end of the spectrum of helping people to be present here and now is things like yoga, mindfulness meditation, theater groups, music groups, things that help people to intensely engage in the present. And we find, and I think history and culture finds that in general, that people are most engaged with each other in the present, not when they sit and remember the past or philosophize, but when they move, when they sing, when they act, when they perform a Shakespeare play, when they perform a musical. That's what makes people feel alive. So one of the important tasks that we have as trauma experts is to promote programs where people can feel fully alive in the present, and to work with whatever method we have to do that. So I'm talking about the influences that I've had. So Sandy McFarlane is an important influence. I think two other people very important are Peter Levine and Pat Ogden and in El Paso, who are body workers, who are people who really made me aware of how trauma lives in the body, is lived out in the body. And they have been my friends, companions, teachers, collaborators for many years also. And what this body work has taught me is that traumatized people develop a terrible relationship to their bodies. Their bodies, and this is really a very fundamental issue in trauma, which is not really in the DSM and not in many of the textbooks. Namely, that at the time that people are exposed to trauma, our bodies are programmed to fight back and to run away and to shut down and to cope with that. And so almost every human being in the US and even more abroad have had really very unpleasant, nasty, horrible experiences and have had bad encounters with people. And we are very resilient people. Our bodies are geared to deal with that and to become angry at the right moment and to get away at the right moment, to run away, to fight back and all those things. We are very dynamic creatures. At the core of trauma is when something happens to you and you cannot do anything to fight back. When somebody holds you down, when you're trapped, when you're held captive, when you're in an operating room and anesthesia wears off and you suddenly feel this horrible pain and you cannot communicate to the surgeon, I'm sorry, Mr. Surgeon, stop cutting because I'm awake. So the essence of trauma is physical immobilization and helplessness. And this becomes a conditioned response. So if you get traumatized, your body wanted to do things, your body wanted to fight back, but you couldn't. And now, and you do have some nice work on that, the brain circuits get rewired, and instead of these chemicals that are being released to help you to take action, they get moved into different areas of the brain, and that causes panic, fear, and collapse. And so an important piece of healing from trauma is to move the circuits back into effective action, into doing things that make you feel protected, safe, and strong. And again, talking cannot quite do that. And so Peter Levine and Pat Ogden taught me how we can help people to actually experience the past in their bodies and let go and to move through it. And that becomes a very important part of dealing with trauma. So, because we now know that trauma is so deeply stored in physical sensations and in physical experience, traumatized people always have a very uncomfortable relationship to their body. They either don't feel it at all or they feel it all the time, but they don't have a deep feeling of ownership of their bodies. And when people like Ruth Lanius and we do neuroimaging studies of traumatized people, we see that the areas of the brain that are engaged in self-perception, in feeling yourself and noticing yourself, are really quite impaired. And so the areas of the brain that go offline is the insula. The insula is sort of the connection between your body and your brain that tells you it's time to go to sleep, that's very nice food, and so your relationship to what your body needs and what your body wants becomes impaired. And so it's not surprising that if traumatized people have such a terrible relationship to their bodies, that their bodies keep playing tricks on them, and they keep feeling uncomfortable in their bodies, that they're always looking for ways of changing the state of their bodies. And so trauma is very specifically associated with a whole range of problems that we see as problems that are in fact solutions or attempted solutions of these bodily problems, like drug addiction. Vince Filletti's ACE study has shown that the relationship between childhood abuse and drug abuse is 4,600% increase. There is almost nothing in medicine that has that degree of correlation. Why do traumatized people become alcoholics and drug abusers? It's because they try to cope with physical experiences that are unbearable and to calm their bodies down. Of course, at the end, the price they pay for it is that their bodies become much more disturbed. Similarly, the relationship between trauma and eating disorders is very great, particularly obesity. And again, what does Filletti find is that people who are terrified of sexuality, their sexuality, other people's sexuality, feel much better when they have a layer of fat to protect them against people's advances and people's interest in them. I said that not being seen can be a very comforting thing for traumatized human beings, and not being an object of sexual advances may make them feel much better. And so this whole relationship to the body keeps coming up. The next influence that was very important for me was the issue of EMDR. And like most other people, the first time I heard about EMDR, I thought that was a pretty silly thing for people to do, to wiggle their fingers in front of people's eyes and then claiming that people's traumatic memories disappear. But in fact, some people in our clinic gave me some demonstrations. I went to training myself and had some very remarkable experiences. And so we became very interested in EMDR. And we went to NIMH, and up to now we have done the only NIMH-funded study on EMDR, comparing EMDR with Prozac. And it turned out that EMDR is a much better treatment than drugs. Our EMDR study actually had the best treatment outcome of any major treatments that have been shown up to now. About 80% of our adult onset trauma victims were completely symptom-free at the end of, well, not at the end of eight weeks of treatment, but when we follow them up 6 months later. And up to now, no other treatment has achieved that degree of success. So that makes you really question, so what is it about EMDR that makes it so interesting? And to my mind, it's very curious that there has been no major research yet to really study what these eye movements do, except that right now, before the book is being published, Ruth Lanius and I are doing such a study, and so before too long we hope to have some answers about that question. But the issue of EMDR for me raised a number of very interesting questions. And because in EMDR you don't ask people to talk about the trauma. You ask them to just bring up the images, the thoughts, the sensations, and then you go through these silly eye movements, and then people after a while go through these dreamlike states, like these hypnopompic states, and when this thing is over, people talk about these issues with much less emotional disturbance. The memories are much less vivid. They become experiences that they have in the past a long time ago. So people can learn to take a distance. And that, of course, to my mind was incredibly interesting, because EMDR is fundamentally not an exposure treatment. You don't keep blasting people with the memories of trauma, and you certainly don't bring them back to it over and over again. It's more an associative treatment. And the other thing, it's not primarily verbal, and it is really something about processing the brain. And for me, EMDR was really the opening of exploring treatments that at first sight might seem a little bit odd. If EMDR can be so useful, when people tell me that tapping acupressure points may be helpful also, so maybe a billion Chinese may not be wrong, maybe there's something to it, and indeed the research is beginning to show that tapping can be very helpful, and it would be very interesting if you find out what the mechanisms of that are. And certainly tapping is one of the many methods that I'm able to use. From EMDR, once I learned about EMDR and how, certainly in terms of acute trauma like car accidents or victims of shootings or rapes, EMDR is such a spectacularly helpful treatment. I got to really think a lot about language. And one of the chapters in my book that I feel proudest of is my language chapter. Because language is a very complicated issue, in that therapists have an undying faith in language and talking being able to resolve people's problems. And that is clearly not the case. Being able to talk about your trauma is not necessarily able to resolve it. And so what is trauma, what is talking good for? And talking is in fact enormously important. And I'm really worried about treatments that are sort of done over the internet without a personal relationship, treatments that don't involve people not being able to find a deep narrative for themselves, because language does give us a chance to know what we know and to overcome our shame about our experiences and to say, this is what happened to me and this happened a long time ago. So language is an enormously important part, and being able to tell somebody, including yourself, what has happened is one of the cornerstones of good trauma treatment. And in this regard, I've relied very heavily on the work of Jamie Pennebaker at the University of Texas, who has extensively studied the function of writing and the capacity of writing to change people's immune systems and change people's relationship to themselves and to open up self-compassion and being able to really tolerate oneself and to really feel, this is what happened to me and this is how I got to be what I am. And once you can put these things into words, it gives people the option and the possibility to start moving their own lives around. Without language and understanding, it's really almost impossible to make new decisions about oneself. So what's wrong with language? So language is very complicated because language is not really about knowing yourself. The function of language is to really come to a common understanding with somebody else. If you ever have a chance to take a little kid to the zoo, see what that kid talks about. It talks about that monkey over there, that thing over there, that thing over there. And so language is really about coming to a common reality out there, and the part of the brain that does talking is very much in the frontal social part of the brain. As Jaak Panksepp once pointed out to me, the language function of the brain is about as far removed from the core of self-experience as evolution could possibly have put it. And so knowing yourself through language is actually extremely complicated. And it takes an exquisite poet to really know oneself through language. Most people aren't very good at it. Particularly traumatized people. Traumatized people tend to suffer from alexithymia, not knowing what's going on with them, not having the pathways activated of self-exploration. I'll get further into that. And so language becomes a very tricky issue with people in general, but traumatized people in particular. I had a particular experience in my own psychoanalysis that confronted me with the complication of language. Namely, I found that lying on that couch, old-fashioned way, when I would get into a very deep personal childhood memory, I found that I had a choice to either keep on yakking and telling my analyst what that little kid back then experienced, or I could continue to deeply experience what it was like for me back then. But I really could not do two things at the same time. And there's a real choice that we have to make between yakking and feeling. And the real deep feeling inside of oneself you can only do when you shut up. And in my book I talk about the research that shows that when you talk to somebody else, you activate a whole different circuit in the brain when you very deeply experience yourself and experience what you've gone through. And so I've become a great fan of interventions that do not rely very heavily on words, because it's very hard to really get to know yourself and rearrange yourself as long as you're sort of yakking to somebody else and are worried about what somebody else is thinking about you. And so that leads me to the next very central theme of the book, which continually is about the things we have learned from neuroscience research and attachment research and how that applies to trauma and its treatment. And so what research has shown is that there are basically two ways in which you can modulate or control or take care of that middle part of your brain right here between your ears, so in the middle. That's sort of where your CPU is. That's the part of your brain that has your map of the world, That's the part of your brain that determines your emotional reactions. That's the part of your brain that determines whether you like somebody or don't like somebody, whether you like a particular food or a particular piece of music. That's all sort of in the middle, primitive limbic part of your brain, over which you have almost no rational control. You cannot really talk your way out of being in love with somebody, or you cannot talk your way into liking a food that makes you vomit, or stuff like that. These states, these proclivities, are pretty much become hardwired in your limbic system, and that's also where most traumatic reactions occur. And nobody would loves to blow up at their kid making too much noise. Nobody really loves to hit their girlfriend when they feel disrespected, or at least I don't think that anybody does. These things happen because something in the limbic brain takes over, and the frontal lobe, the executive brain, cannot control that. And so the big question then is, how do you get to control that limbic brain and become the master of your own ship? And fundamentally, I think there's 3 ways of doing that. The most elementary way is to go via the back door, which is bottom up, and to change your reptilian brain rhythms. And there's a lot in the book about the reptilian brain arousal system, Stephen Porges' work about the polyvagal system, yoga, and the systems that we know exist that allow people to take care of their arousal system. The 2 most outstanding ones there is, one is breathing. Breath control has been used in many unconventional treatments. It has been used in yoga, martial arts, qigong, tai chi, since time immemorial. And it's sort of odd that in Western psychotherapy the power of breath is hardly ever explored, but certainly if you want to learn to control your arousal system, you have to learn to control your breathing. And that gets into a next piece that's more clearly scientifically delineated, and that's the issue of heart rate variability. And what research shows is that good heart rate variability, which is a measure of the integration of breathing and heart action, which is something that Darwin already talked about a long time ago. You can integrate, if that's well integrated, you have nice fluctuations in your heart rate with your breathing, and the more flexible that system is back there, the more flexible your mind becomes. So this core arousal system in the back of your brain sends messages up to your frontal lobes, to the rest of your brain, to calm itself down. So if you have a well-regulated reptilian brain, you can organize that. And so you can organize it through yoga practice, you can organize it through heart rate variability, you can get an app for your iPhone or your Android, you can get a little gizmo from an organization called HeartMath in California, and you can train your reptilian brain to have slow and even breath and to learn to be calm and focused in your mind by changing your breathing. And certainly in our studies of heart rate variability and other people's studies, we find that traumatized people have terribly disturbed reptilian brains. So we need to go into the reptilian brain and help people to focus and to become rhythmically in tune with themselves. I would say without that, it is pretty much impossible to heal from trauma, because that's one of these engines back there that keeps that stuff out there so chaotic. So we're talking about how you can sort of become master of that limbic system in the middle of your brain that contains the memories of terror and fear and rage, and that causes people to explode and shut down. What it turns out is that, and here's the work of Joseph Ledoux becomes very important, a neuroscientist at NYU, who shows that your frontal lobes, by and large, have very little control over your limbic system. These are two different parts of the brain with almost no communication. When you're really angry, when you're really tired, when you're really horny, when you're really starving, it's very hard to talk yourself out of that, or to rationalize yourself out of it. I've been just astounded by these cognitive therapies where people are told to compare their irrational beliefs to reality. I've tried it with my teenage kids. I've tried it during arguments with my wife, and we never find that rationality really brings people to their senses, including my discussions between my colleagues and me. Rationality rarely gets people to take on other people's point of view. So there's a real question about to what degree reason is helpful, and if you ever wonder about it, just watch the Republican primaries sometimes to see how much reasonableness is involved in trying to persuade people of things. So the bad news is that your rational brain, your verbal brain, doesn't really get there. And then there's good news. And the good news is that while your rational brain, your verbal brain, your communicative brain is largely on the sort of the side part, the lateral parts of your prefrontal cortex, and that's the social part. But there's a middle part of your brain that runs like a mohawk from just above your eyes through the medial prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, posterior cingulate, and through the middle of your brain, the midline structures as they're called. And that part of your brain is involved in self-experience, in noticing yourself and noticing what's going on inside of yourself. So what Joseph Ledoux's research shows is that the only part of your conscious brain that is able to have an impact on that mammalian limbic system is the medial prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain located right here that is devoted to your paying attention to yourself, your internal workings. And that gets us into the whole issue of mindfulness. And it's like all these things. Mindfulness is not the answer, but you cannot have a mind without being mindful. You cannot own yourself without being mindful. You cannot own yourself without knowing yourself and knowing what goes on inside of oneself. So here we run into a real issue with traumatized people, namely that they would like to believe that the trauma is out there. It is you, it's other people, it's the past, it's what happened to them back there that caused them to feel the way they do. But in fact, it is their reaction to that that makes them feel the way they do. And so it's really their internal world and their internal organization where the trauma is lodged. It's their internal hyperreactivity, their internal inability to just notice without reacting. And so the landscape of the body is where trauma is being held. It's held inside. And in order to overcome your trauma, you have to start noticing what is going on in your body. And the only way you can learn to notice what goes on in your body is by going into noticing what goes on inside. And so sooner or later, I think all of my colleagues who really do deep trauma treatment at one point or another arrive at the absolute necessity of sitting still and going inside and noticing your internal world and to shut up. And so the cultivation of mindfulness is very important. And once you can notice yourself, the world opens up Because once you can notice yourself and your internal experience, you can start dissecting it, understanding it, working it, moving it around. Of course, in EMDR, you ask people to notice themselves. Another place where you ask people to notice themselves is in internal family systems therapy. Something that I also practice and have a chapter about in the book. And my involvement with parts work is very old. Namely, the moment that I started to learn about trauma, it became very obvious that traumatized people have very different states of mind. In fact, it's these very different states of minds that got me into studying trauma. That people who could be very thoughtful and sensitive one moment could become callous and harsh next, and would become frozen and terrified the next moment, and would become taking drugs. And other people I met were very sensitive, smart, thoughtful people, but when they would get upset, they would arrange their lives to reenact their childhood sexual abuse by having somebody perpetrate some perverse sexual action on them in some... the internet has made it all more possible, where people reenact these things while under other circumstances they are perfectly reasonable people. And so anybody who deals with trauma, studies trauma, gets to understand pretty soon that dissociation and fragmentation is at the core of being traumatized. That at one moment you remember, and next moment you don't remember. At one moment you are the traumatized person, and the next moment you're a very competent, thoughtful parent. And so you shift between these different states. And so again, in order to overcome trauma, you do not only need to deal with the memory of the trauma, as in, let's say, EMDR. You do not only need to cultivate mindfulness by meditation, yoga, etc., etc. You do not only need to deal with your hyperarousal by learning how to breathe to increase your heart rate variability. You do not only need to get to know your body, but you also need to deal with parts and to get to understand how all of these parts, the enraged part, the frightened part, the terrified part, the bullying part of you, are parts that have evolved in the course of time to help you to deal with your traumatic situation. So now we deal with people who do things that are repulsive or upsetting to the outside world. Like they may cut themselves, or they may starve themselves, or do bulimia, or make repeated suicide attempts, or take drugs. And in behavioral health, as people call it these days, people try to get rid of those behaviors. But these behaviors are going to be very hard to get rid of once you understand that they have evolved in order to deal with certain unbearable states. That people take drugs and cut themselves and starve themselves and stuff themselves and vomit for a reason. It helps them to contain their internal world. And I think that most of these treatments of getting rid of bulimia, and getting rid of anorexia, and getting rid of self-mutilation are bound to fail until you deal with the underlying issues and the unbearable sensations that these treatments, that these particular behaviors have evolved to deal with. And in order to do that, you need to really see what those behaviors do for people. So you don't say to people who are suicidal, stop being suicidal, or promise me not to commit suicide. You say to people, that is very good. You always have a choice to kill yourself. That is your choice. So you have a way out. Let's see what other ways out we might see. Maybe there's ways in which you can feel good about your body that makes you not want to take leave of this life. Maybe we can help you to feel so much engagement and pleasure that killing yourself does not become an attractive option any longer. So the issue is really that as long as people are frozen inside and trapped and numb, maybe death will become a welcome option. But the moment you feel engaged with the people around you and you feel alive and you feel pleasure and you look forward to things, you don't want to kill yourself. You don't want to be stoned. You don't want to be in drugs because it will interfere with being fully engaged in life. So the question is, how do you get people to be fully engaged in life? And that gets me to what I think will be the last thing I want to talk about. And that is that, you know, I've done neuroscience, I've done a lot of research in drug treatments. I am very intrigued and pleased with the results that are coming out in the studies of MDMA, also known as ecstasy. I follow that closely also. And when I see the results that come out of the studies, again, I have a reaction of like, that makes perfect sense. So what does MDMA do? It helps people to feel calm. It helps people to feel safe. And from that position of being safe, to feel physiologically safe, not terrified, not hyper-aroused, they can access their trauma. And if you can access the trauma from a position of safety and calm, you can move it through the circuits of the mind and the brain to put it to rest. But so the critical issue is not the ecstasy, although ecstasy might be a nice way of doing that. The critical issue is, how do you help people feel safe inside so they can tolerate the sensations and emotions that accompany the trauma? That is the core challenge. And you might be able to do it with hypnosis, you might be able to do it with mindfulness, you might be able to do it with eye movements, you might be able to do it by sitting still, and you might be able to do it with MDMA. But the core issue is that if you get people to relive their trauma while they're hyper-aroused, then all the parts of the brain that have gone offline at the time of the trauma that has caused the trauma will go offline again the next time they're terrified. So it's very important to feel safe, calm, connected while you relive the trauma. And that's why this uncontrolled exposure treatment of blasting people with the memories of trauma while they do not feel safe is so pernicious, because what it does, it helps people to possibly become desensitized. Of course, many people become extremely upset and oftentimes drink more, make more suicide attempts, become very upset, not surprisingly, because you traumatize people by having them replay their trauma. And so the best you can hope for is desensitization, so that you don't feel the pain and the terror anymore. Now, desensitization is a tricky issue. Not to feel anything is actually what many traumatized people already have. They go through life like zombies because they have learned to shut down their internal experience. They already have started to desensitize themselves. The treatment of trauma is not desensitization. The treatment of trauma is integration. The treatment of trauma is to help you to know in every sinew and fiber of your body of that happened then, and this is what's happening now, and I'm safe now. And the only way to get there is to get all the parts of the brain that have been knocked out by traumatic reliving online, so you feel calm and safe and present. Okay? Now, that getting calm and safe and present, that's really the big challenge. How do we get people there? Ecstasy may be very good for that. Our psychotropic drugs are probably not so good for that. Yoga and meditation, probably quite good for it. But I see a lot of people with very chronic, very severe trauma who cannot do any of these things, who are just too hyper, too shut down to do that, and with whom the work is painstakingly slow. And for them, having found neurofeedback, a way in which you can play computer games with your own brain to rewire the attentional systems in your own brain and calm down these hyper-aroused posterior systems and to activate those knocked out anterior systems become very helpful. And so I'm very much looking forward to your reading my book and having a discussion online and elsewhere about what you find most helpful. And I hope that my book, I'll show it to you again, The Body Keeps the Score. The body does keep the score, that it will help us to debate many of the issues that I have talked about a little bit now, but that you see discussed in much more depth with moving case histories. Let me tell you what some people said about the book. Rachel Huda says, in this inspirational work which seamlessly waves the keen clinical observations, neuroscience, historical analysis, the arts and personal narrative, Van der Kolk has created an authoritative guide to the effects of trauma and pathways to recovery. This is actually my favorite. Stephen Cope, who wrote a book, Yoga and the Quest for the True Self, Purpose of Your Life, a fantastic author and a yoga person. Every once in a while a book comes along that fundamentally changes the way we look at the world. Bessel van der Kolk has written such a book. I hope he's right, and I hope you'll read it, and I hope you'll have discussions about it, and we'll talk about all these complexities as time goes on. Thank you very much. Good trauma work is like very fine neurosurgery. It's extremely skilled work. And good intentions and warm feelings do not substitute for really becoming very good at what you do. But so at some point, the human organism needs to experience what it couldn't experience before. So some condition needs to be created where people can safely visit what has become an odious, terrifying thing. And there's many ways of doing that, but the most important thing is that the mind, the brain, the body needs to be calm enough to visit something that has always been a source of terror. And that's a tricky issue, because indeed the nature of traumatic memory is that it's split off. It sits somewhere, as Freud used to say beautifully in 1893, like a foreign object isolated somewhere, and it pops out. And so these foreign objects need to be integrated into the larger whole. Again, many different ways of doing that. What I like to say about that is if you're a really smart person like Milton Erickson, you do hypnosis. But for hypnosis you need to be really smart, and most of us aren't Milton Erickson. But you know, EMDR is a lovely trauma processing technique, and you don't need to be a genius to learn how to do it. So it's easily available, and so it's to my mind, so the most easily available thing for ordinary human beings. I love EMDR, but anybody who says I'm an EMDR therapist, I go, that's like saying I'm a hammer carpenter. Like, it is a little technique that helps people to process memories, but it's not, you know, it's not a comprehensive piece. It is a lovely, wonderful, in my hands, indispensable technique. I wouldn't know how to be a good trauma therapist without having that skill. But it's just a skill.